talking today to my great friend Christopher Hitchens. We are going to talk about his new memoir, Hitch 22, and his amazing and in some respects inimitable, in all respects inimitable.
Who would want to imitate?
Life story. The thing I was struck by, above all in this story, and maybe it's because I grew up in Canada, is that of all the things we can say about you, the extraordinary things you've done, the ideological and personal journeys you've made, the thing I was struck by is that this is the story of a last child of the British Empire. And in area after area, that fact seems to explain your politics, your life story. I mean, that when we look at your leftism and radical phase, that you were not somebody who was interested in issues of domestic economic management. You were interested in the unfinished business of the British Empire and the areas that you were drawn to. Again, Southern Africa, Ireland, Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan. Did I mention Cyprus already? All of those are all the untidy bits left over from the withdrawal of the empire. And of course, that was the milieu in which you spent your childhood.
That's exactly right. That's very shrewd of you, by the way. I mean, all the places you mentioned, I think, were places where my father would have gone at some point or another to put down some rising or generally restore order. And I was brought up, indeed, on the cusp of the end of the empire. My father was let go by the Navy between 1945, the end of the war in which he served very courageously, and the Suez disaster in 1956. And I could add one thing, which only occurred to me as you were speaking, has a symmetry also, which is my fascination with the United States, whose revolution was in many ways an English revolution, an unfinished one, because Britain still has a monarchy and an established church, but based on, in many ways, Jefferson and Paine, their feeling for the 17th century British Democrats who had removed the head of the king from his shoulders and to some extent disestablished the church and so forth. So yes, it's actually, you're shrewder than you know. That is the clue both to, not just to my own formation, if I can so grandly call it that, but to the things that preoccupy me.
Yes.
Right up to and including something I would never have predicted when I was growing up, that British soldiers would be back in Afghanistan and Mesopotamia, and that I would be cheering them on.
Yes. Well, that...
cheering them on, you know what I mean.
Yes.
Thinking they were on the right side.
That's part of the trajectory, too. It may be a part of your trajectory that is not so often discussed. I mean, that your youthful attitude was one of utter rejection of the empire and all its works. I think you're still an anti-monarchist, which is, I guess, part of the imperial system.
Yes, I'm a Republican. Yes.
In your even in your middle phase, when you were sort of decelerating from that radicalism, you continue to have a very hostile view of the great American hero Winston Churchill. I don't know if that is still something you feel. And how, now that you look back,
I'd rather say extremely critical. I can't quite call myself hostile to Churchill.
Okay.
Try as I may.
But you find him a bit of a phony and a fraud.
He was a blowhard in many ways. His reputation is inflated. I think some of his rhetoric isn't as wonderful as others do either. But behind all that,
most people cut him a lot of slack for his 2 best months.
Yes, there was when he said the whole of his life had been a preparation. That wonderful remark he made, the preparation for this hour. He should be given command over the whole scene. You can think of him exactly thinking, okay, now it's really going to be a fight, and they'll be sorry they started it, and we didn't start this, but we will finish it. And that's magnificent, of course. But in fact, his fiasco at Gallipoli and his appalling intransigence about the independence of India, and his early sympathy actually for National Socialism and fascism, and his brief flirtation with anti-Jewish politics on his own account, I think that's how he found out how nasty and futile it was. Need to be in that picture for it to be understood, and you also have to see the figure of Commander Hitchens, Royal Navy, a bit fed up with all this rhetoric after he's been left on the beach, having served his country and his crown and his flag very handsomely, sort of discarded, and that's the atmosphere in which I grew up. Someone who was a Tory, but had, as I thought of it, very little to be Tory about.
That's one of the great lines of the book. I was about to quote it to you. That was
yeah.
no. So you. it is that's a remarkable story, and your father became somebody who. What was his view by the end toward the entity to which he'd given so much of his service? Did he? I know he's not a man of many words.
He wasn't a man of very many words. He once said, "I sometimes feel we fought on the wrong side in the Second World War." He obviously didn't mean that. We had a terrible fight when he said that. He was in low spirits, and also in spirits, if you understand, in drink a bit when he said that. But that was how bitter he felt about it, because it had come to him to seem that it had all been for nothing, that the Americans had taken the empire away, that the Russians had taken most of Europe away, and then the rest was being fought over by sort of Banana Republic comic and sinister figures like Nkrumah and so forth. That all this valor and sacrifice and austerity and hardship and danger had been for nothing. He was an extremely disillusioned man, and I remember when I said to him, thinking I might cheer him up, that I thought the Royal Navy was doing a great job in the South Atlantic, doing in the filthy Argentine dictatorship, which I'd seen at first hand over the Falklands, where he'd been stationed in the 30s. He was completely unimpressed. He didn't think it was worth fighting for at all. He was a burned-out case by the end. Sad. To say nothing of the other side of Toryism, in other words, the sort of the affluent society, the commercialisation of everything in Britain, the reward for people who, as he would have put it, as I sometimes put it, make money rather than earn it.
Yes.
All of that was an offence to his rather Puritan soul.
Now, there's something bigger going on here than just the fact that his pension didn't keep up with inflation.
Absolutely. Though since you mentioned the pension, I ought to say, after they got rid of him and his brother officers, the men who'd actually borne the heat and burden of the day, they then upped the pension to make recruitment to the Navy by young officers more attractive. So those who hadn't been in the war were going to retire with a proper pension, and those who had were not. He never forgave that. You can, if you want to get an idea of his tone of voice, actually, you can read my brother's prose. My brother reminds me of the old man quite a lot, and is that kind of Tory, and is, of course, tremendously opposed to the liberation of Iraq and the combat with the Taliban in Afghanistan. He takes a sort of Pat Buchanan view of these things.
Was he closer to your father?
Much more so than I was, yes. I don't want to think of myself as a mother's boy, but I was certainly her son in a particular way. I think not that she would have had no preference, I'm sure of that, but we were much more like one another.
And was yours a household where one had to choose?
No. I don't think one could say that. But, yeah, you're born knowing a certain... you're not born. Children are very sensitive to atmosphere. And in disputes between my father and my mother, which were quite common, I tended to take her side, if that's what you mean, yes. And also to look at things through her eyes. She was very beautiful. She had a sense and an instinct for fashion. She tried to open dress shops to sort of brighten the rather dreary scene in which we lived. She'd have liked to go to the theatre and have smart cocktail parties. My father found all that kind of thing completely meaningless. And she wanted me to go to a boarding school and to a university, and my father said, we can't afford it. And she said, oh, yes, we can.
Yeah. Well, is that what makes you perhaps...
And I was on her side about that, too.
Is that what makes you one of the last children of the British Empire? I keep thinking of a scene from one of the Monty Python sketches that didn't become famous. I don't know where I saw it. It isn't in any of the anthologies, but John Cleese...
Try me.
John Cleese plays a headmaster who is speaking to a chapel full of bored boys, and he's commanding their attention for the annual memorial service for those who died to keep China British.
Yes. Isn't that from a film? Isn't that John Cleese in Clockwise?
Maybe. It's someplace super obscure.
It's a not very good film in which Cleese is a headmaster, and it's called Clockwise. It's a fiasco film, but it's not in the Python canon. See?
Okay. All right. Well,
Well, my father spent a lot of his time keeping China British. He was stationed at Wei Hai Wei, the British enclave on the Chinese coast that everyone forgets because they concentrate on Hong Kong. We're not live, right?
Let's hope we can cut this out.
Add that to what they've got under the one-man dear leader type rule of Robert Mugabe. So there's plenty of irony to go around.
So can you? Let's expand this tally a little bit, because it's not like you to be so sentimental. What are the parts? I wasn't
sentimental about India.
What is the part of the tally on that you would still be harsh?
Well, can I just repudiate the charge of sentimentality?